The Outline of History, being a plain history of life and mankind by H.G. Wells, revised and brought up to the end of the Second World War by Raymond Postgate, with maps and plans by J.F. Horben, Volume 2, Book 2, Chapter 8, The Later Postglacial Palaeolithic Men, the First True Men, Later Palaeolithic Age, Section 1, The Coming of Men Like Ourselves, Section 2, The Geography of the Palaeolithic World, Section 3, The Close of the Palaeolithic Age, Section 4, No Submen in America. Well, now we actually have some indication that about 400,000 years ago, there were people in the Americas, but they weren't submen. None of the Homo whatever were submen. Section 1. The Neanderthal type of man prevailed in Europe at least for tens of thousands of years, for ages that make all history seem a thing of yesterday. These nearly human creatures prevailed. If the Heidelberg jaw was that of a Neanderthaler, and if there is no error in the estimate of the age of that jaw, then the Neanderthal race lasted out for more than 200,000 years. Finally, between 40,000 and 25,000 years ago, as the Fourth Glacial Age softened towards more temperate conditions, a different human type came upon the European scene, and it would seem exterminated Homo neanderthalensis. This new type was probably developed in South Asia or Africa, or in lands now submerged in the Mediterranean basins, and as more remains are collected and evidence accumulates, men will learn more of their early stages. At present, we can only guess where and how. Through the slow ages parallel with the Neanderthal cousin, these first true men arose out of some more ape-like progenitor. Well, humans are technically a type of ape, so for hundreds of centuries, they were acquiring skill of hand and limb, and power and bulk of brain in that still unknown environment. They were already far above the Neanderthal level of achievement and intelligence when first they come to our ken, and they had already split into two or more very distinctive races. These newcomers did not migrate into Europe in the strict sense of the word, but rather, as century by century the climate ameliorated, they followed the food and plants to which they were accustomed. As these spread into the new realms that opened to them, the ice was receding, the vegetation was increasing, big game of all sorts was becoming more abundant, steppe-like conditions of pasture and shrub, were bringing with them vast herds of wild horse. Ethnologists, students of race, class these new human races in the same species as ourselves, and with all human races subsequent to them under one common specific name of Homo sapiens. They had quite human brain cases and hands. Their teeth and their necks were anatomically as ours are. We know of two distinct sorts of skeletal remains in this period. The first of these known as Cro-Magnon, and the second as Grimaldi race. But the great bulk of the human traces and appliances we find are either without human bones or with insufficient bones for us to define their associated physical type. There may have been more distinct races than these two. There may have been intermediate types. In the grotto of Cro-Magnon, it was that complete skeletons of one main type of these newer Palaeolithic men, these true men, were first found, and so it is that they are spoken of as Cro-Magnards. These Cro-Magnards were a tall people with very broad faces, prominent noses, and, all things considered, astonishingly big brains. The brain capacity of the woman in the Cro-Magnon cave exceeded that of the average male today. You know, because females have notably smaller brains than males. Her head had been smashed by a heavy blow. There were also, in the same cave with her, the complete skeleton of an older man, nearly 6 feet high, the fragments of a child's skeleton, and the skeletons of 2 young men. There were also flint implements and perforated seashells, used no doubt as ornaments. Such is one sample of the earliest true men. But at the Grimaldi cave near Mentone were discovered 2 skeletons, also of the latter Palaeolithic period, but of a widely contrasted type, with negroid characteristics that point rather to the negroid type. They reach in type towards the Boskop race of South Africa, of which we have already told. There can be no doubt that we have to deal in this period with at least 2, and probably more, highly divergent races of true men. They may have overlapped in time, or Cro-Magnards may have followed the Grimaldi race, and either or both may have been contemporary with the late Neanderthal men. Various authorities have very strong opinions upon these points, but they are, at most, opinions. The appearance of these truly human postglacial Palaeolithic peoples was certainly an enormous leap forward in the history of mankind. Both of these main races had a human forebrain, a human head, and intelligence very like our own. They dispossessed Homo neanderthalensis from his caverns and his stone quarries, and they agreed with modern ethnologists, it would seem, in regarding him as a different species, unlike most savage conquerors, who take the women of the defeated side for their own and interbreed with them. It would seem that the true men would have nothing to do with the Neanderthal race. Women are men. There is no trace of any intermixture between the races. In spite of the fact that the newcomers, being also flint users, were establishing themselves in the very same spots that their predecessors had occupied. We know nothing of the appearance of the Neanderthal man, but this absence of intermixture seems to suggest an extreme hairiness, an ugliness, or a repulsive strangeness in his appearance, over and above his low forehead, his beetle brows, his ape neck, and his inferior stature, or he and she may have been too fierce to tame, says Sir Harry Johnson in A Survey of the Rise of Modern Man in his Views and Reviews. The dim racial remembrance of such gorilla-like monsters, with cunning brains, shambling gait, hairy bodies, strong teeth, and possibly cannibalistic tendencies, may be the germ of the ogre in folklore. These true men of the Palaeolithic age, who replaced the Neanderthalers, were coming into a milder climate, and although they used the caves and shelters of their predecessors, they lived largely in the open. They were hunting peoples, and some or all of them appear to have hunted the mammoth and the wild horse, as well as the reindeer, bison, and aurochs. You know, the descendants became cows. They ate much horse. At a great open-air camp in Siluter, where they seem to have had annual gatherings for many centuries, it is estimated that there are the bones of 100,000 horses, besides reindeer, mammoth, and bison bones. They probably followed herds of horses. The little bearded ponies of that age, as these moved after pasture, They hung about on the flanks of the herd and became very wise about its habits and dispositions. A large part of these men's lives must have been spent in watching animals. So, reindeer age articles, azilian, pierced for thong, leather strap, drawn to differing scales. We have bone points, pebble cut mortar, bone needles, arrow straighteners, reindeer horn fashioned, Australian natives method of throwing stick or spear thrower. They call that the addle. So the female, no, that's not the female figures. Goats or longhorn sheep. One of the things about stuff like that is that sometimes we find information encoded in those things. And before we get into the other, we have a reindeer age masterpiece, painting in 4 colors. Cave of Altamira, Spain. I like the 6-part theory Amprops thing that was going on for about 17,500 years. Whether they tamed and domesticated the horse is still an open question. Perhaps they learned to do so by degrees as the centuries passed. At any rate, we find late Palaeolithic drawings of horses with marks about the heads that are strongly suggestive of bridles, and there exists a carving of a horse's head showing what is perhaps a rope of twisted skin or tendon. But even if they tamed the horse, it is still more doubtful whether they rode it or had much use for it when it was tamed. The horse, they knew, was a wild pony with a beard under its chin, not up to carrying a man for any distance. It is improbable that these men had yet learnt the rather unnatural use of animals' milk as food. If they tamed the horse at last, it was the only animal they seemed to have tamed. They had no dogs, and they had little to do with any sort of domesticated sheep or cattle. It greatly aids us to realize their common humanity that these earliest true men could draw. Indeed, they drew astonishingly well. They were, by all standards, savages, but they were artistic savages. They drew better than any of their successors down to the beginnings of history. They drew and painted on the cliffs and walls of the caves. They had wrested from the Neanderthal men, and the surviving drawings come to the ethnologist, puzzling over bones and scraps with the effect of a plain message shining through guesswork and darkness. They drew on bones and antlers. They carved little figures. These later Palaeolithic people not only drew remarkably well for our information, and with an increasing skill as the centuries passed, but they have also left us other information about their lives in their graves. They buried their dead, often with ornaments, weapons, and food. They used a lot of color in the burial and evidently painted the body. From that, one may infer that they painted their bodies during life. Paint was a big fact in their lives. They were inveterate painters. They used black, brown, red, yellow, and white pigments, and the pigments they used endure to this day in the caves and on the cliff surfaces of France and Spain. Well, it turns out all over the world, even earlier than that. Of all modern races, none has shown so pictorial a disposition. The nearest approach to it has been among the American Indians. These drawings and paintings of the latter Palaeolithic people went on through a long period of time, and the present wide fluctuations in artistic merit. In its early stages, the drawing is often primitive, like the drawing of clever children. Quadrupeds are usually drawn with one hind leg and one foreleg, as children draw them to this day. The legs on the other side were too much for the artist's technique. Perhaps the first drawings began as children's drawings begin, out of idle scratchings. The savage scratched with a flint on a smooth rock surface and was reminded of some line or gesture. Well, what if we don't have our modern technology? Are we going to be considered savages? But their solid carvings are at least as old as their first pictures. The earlier drawings betray a complete incapacity to group animals. As the centuries progressed, more skillful artists appeared. The representations of beasts became, at last, astonishingly vivid and like. And even at the crest of their artistic time, they still drew in profile, as children do. Perspective and the foreshortening needed for front and back views were too much for them. The mammoth and the horse are among the commonest themes. In the caves of the north of Spain, there are no drawings of men, only of animals, but in eastern Spain there are many paintings dating from the later divisions of this period in which human figures are displayed. Some of the people also made little ivory and soapstone statuettes, and among these are some very fat female figures. They are like Bushman women. The human sculpture of the earlier times inclined to caricature, and generally such human figures as they represent are far below the animal studies in vigor and veracity. Well, I was satisfied with the idea that they just exaggerated the curves and all that, but it turns out that there's actually very accurate representations of some of the inner workings of people combined with these brain structures and all that. Later on, there was more grace and less coarseness in the human representations. One small ivory head discovered is that of a girl with an elaborate coiffure. These people, at a later stage, also scratched and engraved designs on ivory and bone. Some of the most interesting groups of figures are carved very curiously round bone, and especially round rods of deer bone, so that it is impossible to see the entire design altogether. Figures have also been found modeled in clay, although no Paleolithic people made any use of pottery. Many of the paintings are found in the depths of unlit caves. They are often difficult of access. The artist must have employed lamps to do their work, and shallow soapstone lamps in which fat could have been burnt have been found. Whether the seeing of these cavern paintings was in some way ceremonial, or under what circumstances they were seen, we are now altogether at a loss to imagine. Now, some of the caves, we don't find the evidence, but we do find that there were a couple days a year that they had light down there, and therefore must have been a ceremonial cave. In the south and east of Spain, however, the drawings are not in caves, but upon overhung rock shelters in a good light. Archaeologists distinguish at present three chief stages in the history of these newer Paleolithic men, these true men in Europe, and we must name these stages here, but it may be as well to note at the same time that it is a matter of the utmost difficulty to distinguish which of two deposits in different places is the older are newer. We may very well be dealing with the work of more or less contemporary and different races when we think we are dealing with successive ones. We are dealing, the reader must bear in mind, with little disconnected patches of material, a few score altogether. The earliest stage, usually distinguished by the experts, is the Aurignacian from the grotto of Aurignac. It is characterized by very well-made flint implements and by a rapid development of art, and more particularly of statuettes and wall paintings. The most esteemed of the painted caves is ascribed to the latter part of this, the first of the three subdivisions of the newer Palaeolithic. The second subdivision of this period is called the Solutrean, from Solutra, and is distinguished particularly by the quality and beauty of its stone implements. Some of its razor-like blades are only equaled and not surpassed by the very best of the Neolithic work. They are, of course, unpolished, but the best specimens are as thin as steel blades and almost as sharp. Finally, it would seem, came the Magdalenian from La Madeleine stage, in which the horse and reindeer were dwindling in numbers and the red deer coming into Europe. The stone implements are smaller, and there is a great quantity of bone harpoons, spearheads, needles, and the like. The hunters of the third and last stage of the latter Palaeolithic age appear to have supplemented a diminishing food supply by fishing. The characteristic art of the period consists of deep reliefs done upon bone and line engraving upon bone. It is to this period that the designs drawn round bones belong. And it has been suggested that these designs upon round bones were used to print colored designs upon leather. Some of the workmanship on bone was extraordinarily fine. Parkin quotes from De Mortale about the reindeer age, Magdalenian bone needles, that they are much superior to those of later, even historical times, down to the Renaissance. The Romans, for example, never had needles comparable to those of the Magdalenian epoch. It is quite impossible at present to guess at the relative lengths of these ages. We are not even positive about the relative relationship. Each lasted perhaps for 4 or 5 more thousand years, more than double the time from the Christian era to our own day. Moreover, these divisions are based mainly upon the remains found in France and the north of Spain. As we go into the south of Spain and Italy and North Africa, their characteristics are no longer traceable. There was a different type of life to the south, different food, and a different equipment. At last, it would seem that circumstances began to turn altogether against these hunting, newer Palaeolithic people who had flourished for so long in Europe. They disappeared. New kinds of men appeared from the south and east, replacing them. These latter seemed to have brought in bow and arrows. They had domesticated animals and cultivated the soil. A new way of living, the Neolithic way of living, spread over the European area, and the life of the reindeer age and of the later Palaeolithic men, after a reign vastly greater than the time between ourselves and the very earliest beginnings of recorded history, passed off the European stage. There is, perhaps, a disposition on the part of some writers to exaggerate the intellectual and physical qualities of these latter Palaeolithic men and make a wonder of them. Collectively considered, these people had remarkable gifts, but a little reflection will show that they had almost as remarkable deficiencies. The tremendous advance they display upon their Neanderthal predecessors and their special artistic gift must not blind us to their very obvious limitations. For all the quantity of their brains, the quality was narrow and special. They had vivid perceptions, an acute sense of animal form. They had the real artist's impulse to render. So far, they were fully grown human beings. But that disposition to paint and draw is shown today by the Bushmen, by California Indians, and by Australian blackfellows. It is not a mark of all-round high intellectual quality. And why is that the case? Well, now people say, oh, well, we use our intelligence for other things. Okay. The cumulative effect of their drawings and paintings is very great, but we must not make the mistake of crowding all these achievements together in our minds as though they had suddenly flashed out upon the world in a brief interval of time, or as though they were all the achievements of one people. These races of reindeer men were in undisturbed possession of Western Europe for a period at least 10 times as long as the interval between ourselves and the beginning of the Christian era, and vary their life to its utmost possibilities. While they were still working and learning their terrain to the point where they could survive in harder conditions than we have now. So they were in close contact with animals, but they never seemed to have got to terms with any animal unless it was the horse. They had no dogs. They had no properly domesticated animals at all. They watched and drew and killed and ate. They do not seem to have cooked their food. Perhaps they scorched and grilled it, but they could not have done much more, because they had no cooking implements. Although they had clay available, and although there are several Paleolithic clay figures on record, they had no pottery. Although they had great variety of flint and bone implements, they never rose to the possibilities of using timber for permanent shelters or such like structures. They never made hafted axes or the like that would enable them to deal with timber. There is a suggestion in some of the drawings of a fence of stakes in which a mammoth seems to be entangled, that they find in Saudi Arabia and parts of Asia and stuff, that they did build pens to capture animals, or dig around rocks sometimes. But here we may be dealing with superimposed scratchings. They had no buildings. Well, it turns out that there actually were buildings built at that time, but it is not even certain that they had tents or huts. They may have had simple skin tents. Some of the drawings seem to suggest as much. It is doubtful if they knew of the bow. They left no good arrowheads behind them. The doubt whether the Paleolithic men of the reindeer age used the bow, obviously, does not apply to the Paleolithic men of the comparatively late Capsian culture. A careless reader might perhaps jump to the conclusion that the statement applies to all Paleolithic men. The earlier Paleolithic men, the Neanderthalers, were certainly without bows, and the reindeer men probably knew nothing of archery. Certain of their implements are said to be arrow straighteners by distinguished authorities, but that is about as much evidence as we have of arrows. They may have used sharpened sticks as arrows. They had no cultivation of grain or vegetables of any sort. Their women were probably squaws, smaller than the men. The early statuettes represent them as grossly fat, almost as the Bushman women are often fat today. They are fatted for marriage, and so perhaps were these Stone Age squaws. They were smaller than the men because, no doubt, they began to bear children before they had grown to their fullest possibilities. Well, women are always notably smaller on average than the men, height-wise. Primitive woman was a subjected creature. Well, now it's the fashion trends and stuff, so it's not any different, is it? These latter Paleolithic men clothed themselves, it would seem, in skins, if they clothed themselves at all. These skins they prepared with skill and elaboration, and towards the end of the age, they used bone needles, no doubt, to sew these pelts. One may guess pretty safely that they painted these skins, and it has even been supposed printed off designs upon them from bone cylinders. But their garments were mere wraps. There are no clasps or catches to be found. They do not seem to have used grass or such like fiber for textiles. Their statuettes are naked. They were, in fact, except for a fur wrap in cold weather, naked, painted savages. And, well, if you look at anthropological theory, the savage philosopher was always capable of stuff that took multiple generations to figure out. So it's not quite the insult if you look into what these people were. In their women and their art, they were like the Bushmen of South Africa. In the pursuit of the reindeer herd, they were like the Indians of Labrador. Physically, they were probably very like the Indians of Labrador. These hunters lived on open steppes for 200 centuries or so, 10 times the length of the Christian era. They were, perhaps, overtaken by the growth of the European forests as the climate became milder and damper, when the wild horse and the reindeer diminished in Europe, and a newer type of human culture with a greater power over food supply, a greater tenacity of settlement, and probably a larger social organization arose. The reindeer men had to learn fresh ways of living or to disappear. Section 2. It is very important to grasp the differences between the geography of the reindeer age and the present time. It is a matter too often overlooked. Even so eminent a man as Dr. Field Osborne is caught napping in this respect. He can write, for example, of the invasion of Spain by the Chilean and Mousterian cultures coming by the way of North Africa from Egypt, as though then as now that was the only possible route. Professor Obermeyer goes further. He speculates whether the Chilean culture reached Spain from Africa on some primitive kind of raft. That raft was quite unnecessary. Well, it turns out there were ancient sea voyages. The approximate map of Europe and near Asia, as it was about 30,000 years ago, see page 84 that we've already shown, will show at a glance the absurdity of thus treating Spain as a permanently distinguishable piece of the world. That, however, is a remark by the way. The broader issue is manifestly marginal nature. The manifestly marginal nature of all these Paleolithic peoples of Europe. We are not yet in possession of the main text of the human story. The life of the reindeer men was a frontier life. They lived on bleak highlands to the north of the better lands of the world. To the south and west was the Mediterranean basin. There, hidden for ever perhaps under the blue waters, must be the remains of contemporaries of the reindeer men, who were probably much more advanced and sophisticated. These great valleys about the lakes of the Mediterranean bed and in the Red Sea Triangle probably afforded admirable conditions for human development. The main stage of human history, 20,000 years ago, lay to the southeast of the Franco-Spanish area. Well, some of those people were making their way to America before that. The only area of the continent of Europe as yet at all adequately searched for vestiges of early man. It is due largely to the labors of Professor Obermeyer of Madrid that we begin to realize that while the reindeer men prevailed in France and North Spain, the men who wandered over the greater part of the Spanish territory and North Africa were of a different culture, which he calls, after a place name in Tunis, the Capsian culture. The Capsian did not follow the Aragonesian, Silurian, and Magdalenian stages of France, but it was contemporary with it. It was different, and on the whole, it suggests more advanced social conditions. It lacks, perhaps, the representative vigor of the northern art, which includes the wonderful painted Altamira caves. But on the other hand, it has provided a considerable number of paintings of human beings engaged in various activities. They are, for the most part, painted on rock surfaces, and they resemble in character and treatment many ancient and modern rock paintings done by the Bushmen of South Africa. Capsian paintings have also been found in Italy. The life recorded by the Capsian paintings is an easier life under more agreeable climatic conditions than that of the reindeer hunters to the north. Reindeer, bear, and bison are not shown, and the chief animals are the ordinary deer and wild ox. Rhinoceros, wild ass, donkey, and ibex also appear. Men carry bows and are naked, but most of the female figures are represented as clothed in skirts. Feather ornaments are frequent. One scene shows a boar hunt, and another the smoking out of a hive of wild bees. There are also groupings that very probably represent ceremonial dances, and figures of men wearing masks representing animals over their heads and shoulders. When Professor Obermeyer showed the author some of the tracings of these pictures in Madrid some years ago, he pointed out a curious disposition to distort the human figure while representing animals without distortion very faithfully and recognizably. Always the human waist is elongated and much compressed, and often legs are greatly inflated. This conventionality passes on in the later pictures into an almost diagrammatic treatment of human beings. The pictures cease to be pictures and become signs. Section 3. It was about 12,000 or fewer years ago that with the spread of forests and a great change of the fauna, the long prevalence of the hunting life in Europe drew to its end. Reindeer vanished. Changing conditions frequently bring with them new diseases. There may have been prehistoric pestilences. In France, there seems to have been a gap before the new population appeared, but in the south of Europe, the later Capsian culture passes by what Obermeyer calls the Palaeolithic stage into the Azilian from the cave of the Mas d'Azil. The conventional painting of the Caspian folk is still more diagrammatic in the Azilian stage, and great numbers of pebbles are found painted with brushstrokes that we now know to stand for standard types of man and beast. Various Australian tribes at the present time have very similar painted stones, which are called soul stones, and are supposed to embody part or all of the soul or quality of a deceased ancestor. These new people were a darkish, fine-featured people. They were the first comers of a race, the Mediterranean, dark white or Iberian race, which is still the prevailing race in southern Europe. Their communities extended northward with the spread of the forests to replace the steppes and the wane of the hunters, some 10,000 or 12,000 years ago. The map of the world was assuming something like its present outlines. The landscape and the Flora and fauna were taking on their existing characteristics. The prevailing animals in the spreading woods of Europe were the royal stag, the great ox, and the bison. The mammoth and the musk ox, Arctic forms, had gone. The great ox, or aurochs, is now extinct, but it survived in the German forest up to the time of the Roman Empire, and perhaps much later. It was never domesticated. Domestic cattle were brought into Europe later and are of a different breed. The great ox stood 11 feet high at the shoulder, as high as an elephant. There were still lions in the Balkan Peninsula, and they remained there until about 1000 or 1200 BCE. The lions of Württemberg and South Germany in those days were twice the size of the modern lion. South Russia and Central Asia were thickly wooded then, and there were elephants in Mesopotamia and Syria, and a fauna in Algeria that was tropical African in character. Hitherto, men in Europe had never gone farther north than the Baltic Sea or the British Isles, but now the Scandinavian peninsula and perhaps Great Russia were becoming possible regions for human occupation. There are no Palaeolithic remains in Sweden or Norway. Man, when he entered these countries, was early at the Neolithic stage of social development. Reindeer age, origination, stag and salmon, and salmon engraved in reindeer horn, salmon, engraved stone, bear engraved on wall, on ivory, mammoth on cave wall, on reindeer antler, horse's head carved in ivory, head of a woman carved in ivory, stone statuettes, painted pebbles, a zillion age. Section 4. There is no really convincing evidence of man in America before the end of the Pleistocene. Aeoliths are said to have been found in places, but not abundantly. The same relaxation of the climate that permitted the retreat of the reindeer hunters into Russia and Siberia as the Neolithic tribes advanced may have allowed them to wander across the land that is now cut by the Bering Strait and so reach the American continent. Turns out that most of the earlier stuff came on the Atlantic coast. They spread thence southward, age by age. When they reached South America, they found the giant sloth, the megatherium, the glyptodon, and many other extinct creatures still flourishing. The glyptodon was a monstrous South American armadillo, and it is said that a human skeleton has been found buried beneath its huge tortoise-like shell. All the human remains in America are apparently of an Amerindian character. In America, there does not seem to have been any preceding race of submen. We have already noted the one scrap of evidence to the contrary, a single doubtful tooth. Man was, while the Nebraska man turned out not to be human at all, not primate. Man was fully man when he entered America. The Old World was the nursery of the subraces of mankind. Somewhere between South Africa and the East Indies and the Mediterranean, it was that these subraces worked out their destinies as lands rose and sank, and forest gave place to desert, and desert to forest. It may have been where now the Indian Ocean extends. Let it be repeated once more that the account of Palaeolithic man is a partial account drawn from what is, at present, the only available material, the European material. The material for the main story is still inaccessible. Well, in the 1950s, there was evidence of the Smithsonian more advanced culture almost 40,000 years ago in Peru. The main story was going on while the Neanderthaler wandered over Europe in some region as yet not defined, and it may be submerged now beyond our exploration. And of course, such conditions can destroy things too, right? So we have the fourth and last glacial age, Mousterian type of implement, the Neanderthal man, the Argonatian age, the Solutrean age, the Magdalenian age, the Azilian age, the Neolithic age, the Bronze age, the Iron age. We have the end of the early Palaeolithic period, the late Palaeolithic period, the age of cultivation, so 50,000, 35,000, 35,000 to 15,000, 15,000 to 1920, steppe period, forest transition period, modern conditions. So the first option, we have the well-made implements, statuettes and cave pictures, the best Palaeolithic implements, the smaller stone implements, bone fishhooks, engraved bones, and so on, under the classification of reindeer men, the painted pebbles of the Azilian age, the polished stone implements, axe heads, arrowheads, pottery, and domestic animals of the Neolithic age. And so we have the existing races actually go back about, their modern humans kind of descend from the same group here. The diagram showing the estimated duration of the true human periods